I'm going to call Jenny Salisa.
Thank you, Mr Chair, for this call on the Residential Tenancy Amendment Bill. Mr Chair, putting in place a legal framework to ensure that residential tenants are renting safe and healthy homes is crucial. This bill proposes to introduce some useful provisions towards providing standards for housing in large private rental, but, Mr Chair, it does not go far enough to address the dreadful circumstances that many families are living in, especially as we go into winter. And I'd like to tautoko my colleague, Honourable Damien O'Connor. We have a responsibility, Mr Chair, as parliamentarians. 121 of us chosen by our constituents to come into this House. We have a responsibility to do our best to save children's lives. You know, when we sit on this side and we hear members of parliament, particularly from the other side, talking about the cost, that it is too expensive to heat and to insulate houses, Mr Chair. But when you actually put on the other side that we're talking about children's lives, we should actually feel a little bit ashamed, or maybe a lot ashamed, that we are not doing what we as responsible MPs should be doing. Mr Chair, minimum insulation standards for private rental houses are a step in the right direction. They are. However, this national government should do more. This bill proposes a minimum insulation standard, but Mr Speaker, when you insulate a cold house, that house still remains cold. You insulate a cold house, but you don't put in efficient modern heating. Do you think that house will magically become warm, dry and healthy? No, it will not. And I agree with Dr. Russell Wills. This bill should do much better for our children. This is a shameful bill. This is an opportunity to do right by our children, but we are not doing that, Mr Speaker. Rental houses need to be warm, dry and healthy. My question, Mr Speaker, as we talk about insulating houses, are we also going to ensure minimum insulation for garages? Just this last week, we saw so many garages where families are living. I don't think this current legislation actually covers minimum insulation for garages, but it is a reality that we have too many families living in garages. And as we go into winter, Mr Chair, we should also consider the fact that there are families that have been forced out of houses to live in cars as well and in garages. They also need to live in warm, dry conditions. Mr Chair, the Productivity Commission stated in its report on housing affordability that generally the quality of New Zealand's housing stock is considered to be poor. This issue of quality applies to both private as well as to Housing New Zealand state houses. And in the Auckland Regional Public Health Service submission to the Select Committee for Health, they stated that New Zealand currently has a high proportion of unhealthy rental homes. The average temperature, Mr Chair, in almost a third of New Zealand homes is below the WHO recommendations. The WHO recommends a minimum indoor temperature of 18 degrees for most people, and if you are a child, if you are elderly or if you are disabled, they recommend 21 degrees for a house. But in this country, the mean temperature in Auckland, which is what was in the submission, is around 16.5 degrees. 16.5 degrees is pretty cold, Mr Chair, and it is something that this legislation should actually cover, insulation as well as minimum standards of heating. Clause 6, Mr Chair, of this bill covers information that must be included, which includes tenancy agreements. Clause 6, subsection 3, would require a landlord to describe the insulation which is installed at a property he or she is renting out. Omitting to provide this information would be an unlawful act. But, Mr Chair, this bill came back from the Select Committee with an amended Clause 6, subsection 3, where landlords would be allowed to state that despite making all reasonable efforts, they have not been able to satisfy themselves to the extent of insulation. So, Mr Chair, I worry that this is a fairly slippery set of requirements whereby insulation that is too onerous may easily allow some landlords to find their way around